For this set of lectures, we'll start talking about ethical guidelines, especially about conducting your own research, but also as a way to examine other research to see if it was conducted in similar ways. Please note that some of the guidelines that we will talk about were implemented not that long ago, between 50 and 70 years, let's say. And of course, research, especially in medicine, but even in psychology, has been conducted for longer than that period. And therefore, if you are looking up older articles, you will find that they will not always fall under the guidelines of modern ethics. Now, to start, probably one of the most infamous of these types of studies that violated pretty much all known ethical guidelines was known as the Tuskegee syphilis study, and this was conducted in Tuskegee, which is in Alabama of this country. So the study itself was started in 1932, and it was supposedly, well, I mean, that's technically what it was for, to study the long-term effects of syphilis when left untreated. Now, syphilis is an STI, a sexually transmitted infection, or STD, if you've heard it like that, a sexually transmitted disease, and it is caused by a type of bacteria. Now, of course, that means that it can be treated with antibiotics, but as I'll talk about in a moment, those are not really that old either, even though they were made widespread during the course of this study. A little bit of background on syphilis. So if you contract syphilis, generally the first set of symptoms people will have will be these sores. These sores will be present in your mouth, on the genitalia, and in the anus, and they're generally not painful, and so people oftentimes will overlook them. After the sores will tend to come rashes, where people will get rashes at different parts and sometimes in many areas of their body. And following this, oftentimes people who suffer from syphilis, if it is still not treated, will go into sort of a latent phase where it will still be present in the body. People can still infect other people, but they do not have any outward symptoms. Now, the third and final stage of this is when it's probably its most severe. While it doesn't affect everybody, it does affect a lot of people in whom this has been allowed to advance to that degree. And for them, they oftentimes suffer pretty severe organ damage and failure along with neurological damage. And while this can be treated now, the damage can oftentimes not be repaired. Now, in the study itself, 600 African American men were recruited. Out of these, 399 were already positive, meaning they were infected with syphilis at the time. The remaining 201 were not and served as a control. Now, there's very little evidence to suggest that they were told anything about the actual nature of the study. In fact, many of them were directly lied to, and they were told things like they had bad blood and this was the reason why they were suffering the various symptoms that they had, instead of actually being told that they had syphilis. In fact, some of the reports indicate that in the town that these people lived in, that the doctors who already were there and who could have treated this as it became more known were actually instructed not to treat these patients so that they could continue on with the study. And these people were not actually told about this. To make matters worse, this is over the course of this time, World War II happened. A large portion of these men signed up to be soldiers ultimately and go to war. And whatever their feelings on war were, many of the soldiers who went to go fight for this war received benefits after they survived when they came back as sort of a reward, I guess. Reward maybe is not the right word. Anyway, it was due payment for their services. This is oftentimes, or at least part of it, referred to as the GI Bill, and this is really what results in veterans being able to go to college for free. And when these men went to go sign up or to volunteer, they were screened and told that they were sick and they had syphilis, and instead of that then being treated at the time, which they were beginning to be able to do, the doctors and researchers of the study itself actually intervened and prevented them from getting treatment, but that also barred them from being able to enter the military and thus restricted them from being able to receive any of these benefits. Now, please remember, during these times, African Americans in general were quite disenfranchised, and this was one of the ways in which they could have potentially improved their quote unquote lot in life as opposed to theirs, in regard to their socioeconomic status and standing. Of course, that being denied for them is not only bad for them, but their families as well. Now, to make matters worse, while at the onset of this study in the 1930s, antibacterial medication or antibiotics were just starting to be made. In fact, they weren't really widely used until the 1940s when penicillin became a thing. So just to keep in mind, the use of antibiotics that we take pretty much for granted nowadays, in fact, so much so that we can put it into cattle feed and put extra cattle close together and just pump it through them so they don't get sick in close proximity, is actually not that old. Antibiotics are not even 100 years. But anyway, penicillin becomes widely available in the 1940s. Now, even then, when this treatment is available, it is not given to these African American men who are sick from syphilis, and it is not given to them for another 30 years. In fact, the study was finally shut down in 1972. None of them were treated during this time, when a public health services employee went to the press and basically outed this whole thing, and it forced it to shut down. I would recommend reading more about this, as this is, well, a dark moment in the past of research, and I suppose in this country, but it was pretty rough. If you would like to, I have posted the complete final report of this study on iLearn at the end, where there are extra articles. Now, this violates our current codes of ethics in pretty direct ways, and it pretty much violates them in all the ways that we're told not to. The first is that researchers lied about the purpose of the study. They did not tell people that this was a study to examine untreated syphilis over the course of its progression, and by keeping the true purposes of the study hidden, they did not allow the participants themselves to make informed decisions about their own participation. If they weren't told about the actual purposes of the study, then any decisions they made about wanting to participate or not are ultimately not founded, because they're based on, well, a set of lies. And in this way, that is a pretty severe violation of ethics. Now, please note that just because you tell people that a study could be dangerous or have some pain involved or some such, doesn't mean that no one will take part. There'll still be people who oftentimes will take part in research, even if it is uncomfortable. Maybe not so much as if you're going to have this severe sexually transmitted disease that you could pass on to your family, which, by the way, can even be passed on from mothers to their children in vivo. Anyhow, when a researcher lies about the purpose of a study, it robs the participants of being able to make informed decisions, and that is a severe ethical violation. This is different than deception, mind you, which we will discuss later. Further, participants were directly harmed. The use of penicillin and other antibiotics was withheld from them, and treatment was withheld from them not only in the study itself, but from their surrounding communities. Researchers actually implemented policies that prevented them from getting treated, and this is a direct violation of ethics. In fact, in current day ethical rules, if you are administering the test of some kind of medication against a control or placebo group and you find out that this medication actually has benefits, you are legally mandated to make that new treatment available to all members who are in the control or placebo groups. It is not ethical to withhold it. In fact, you have to immediately, upon recognition that that medication is helpful, at least offer it to those groups. It might be occasionally allowed that those people can then choose to withhold from receiving that medication until the end of a study, but that is up to them to make their own decisions. Finally, all the participants in this study were from a disadvantaged group. They were all African American men in a time where, well, let's be honest, even this time isn't that great, but it was worse then. Anyhow, These participants came from disadvantaged groups, not only because of their racial backgrounds, but also because of their socioeconomic backgrounds. In fact, one of the ways in which they were incentivized to take part in the study is that they were told that they would have free medical treatment and they would be paid for their burial services, which might not sound like something to you, but if you have never been able to go to a doctor and you can barely make ends meet, that becomes quite the large incentive. Now, all of them being from this type of disadvantaged group, the reason this is a violation of ethics is because syphilis can infect all human beings, regardless of their background or group membership. And using only a subset of the population, specifically a disadvantaged subset of the population, when the entire population seeks or could potentially gain from that research, this is yet another violation of current day ethics. Now, perhaps not all studies are so direct and clear in their violation of ethics, even though many people have very, very strong feelings about Milgram's obedience studies. Now, these are probably also some of the most infamous studies in psychology, even though, I mean, I guess Tuskegee is not really in psychology, it's more biomedical research. Anyhow, so here's just a bunch of stuff from the Milgram studies. You can pause and look through this and I guess some more depth, that way you can actually read it. But let me first talk about how the study took part. So a participant would come into the laboratory, and when they came into the laboratory, there was another person there also who was an accomplice of the experimenters. The participant was introduced to the accomplice and were told that both of them were actually participants. They were then told that these two individuals would be randomly selected, to one of them being a teacher and the other would be the learner. Now, the experiment was set up in such a way that the actual participant was always the teacher. Now, the way this went was the learner, who was an accomplice of the experiment, was shown to another room and they were hooked up to an electric shock machine, a machine that could apply electric voltage to a human being. Oftentimes this is done by gluing two pads to the forearm and then putting electric voltage across it. Now, the teacher, on the other hand, who is the actual participant, would sit down in front of this box, which I've shown a picture of here, and they communicated with the learner via an intercom system. And the goal of this study, as they were told to the actual participants before the debriefing happened, was to see and test an effective new way to learn concepts in a ultimately school environment. And they were testing the learner on a set of word associations. So they would say one word, and the learner had a response set of 4 other words that they could respond with, and then the teacher would mark them as correct or not. Now, if they were correct, great, they would move on to the next question, but if they made a mistake, then they would receive an electric shock. Now, on the first mistake, they received an electric shock of 15 volts. Ultimately, the teacher would press the first of the levers shown on this box here. If they made another mistake, they would receive a second shock, which would be 15 volts higher. They would click the next switch on this volt shock box thing. And this would continue after they made mistakes over and over and over. Now, if you look carefully at this box, you will see that there are actually little labels underneath the little switches indicating how severe these shocks are. Now, the final series of switches go beyond danger severe shock, and they're just little X's underneath them. That final switch corresponds to a voltage of 450 volts. For reference, the voltage that comes out of the mains, or the voltage across the mains in a typical American household, is 120 volts. And anybody who has been electric shocked knows that it's not the most fun experience. Now, as they go on, of course, the accomplice is not actually getting electrically shocked, but the teachers don't know that, the actual participants. And what they're hearing through the intercom is actually a series of scripted responses. And part of those are presented here. Now, at the different degrees of shock voltage, the learner, or the accomplice, begins to complain. As you can look at the first series, it's basically just grunts and that this hurts. Now, at 150 volts, they start calling for the experimenter and are asked to get out of here. It gets worse, they grunt some more, they shout in pain. At 195 volts, they're pretty much screaming to be let out. You can watch video recordings of this transcript if you would like. It is not the easiest thing to hear, but there's forewarning, and I suppose it is something interesting to know. Please notice that at 195 volts, the accomplice actually states that their heart is bothering them and to let them out and to let them out. It continues and it continues all the way up to 270 volts, at which point you begin to hear screaming about, again, being let out and let out. At 300 volts, after screaming, they state that they will just not answer anymore. And finally, at 330 volts, they continue screaming, let me out, and it just carries on like this. Now, during this time, the actual participants, the teachers who are administering these not real, but to them real electric shocks, begin to become more and more agitated and distressed. Now, in response to their distress, they oftentimes look to Milgram, who was standing right beside them in a white lab coat taking notes. When they would begin to have doubts, Milgram would apply 4 prods. Those are presented here, and they were always presented in this order. The first, when they expressed signs of discomfort, was please continue or please go on. If they once again looked to Milgram or they showed signs of wanting to stop, the second prod was applied, where Milgram would state that the experiment required that they continue. If that was insufficient, then they would state, or Milgram stated, it is absolutely essential that you continue. The final and fourth prod was that you have no other choice, you must go on. Now please note that these people were all told at the beginning of this experiment that they were free to leave at any point in time. That being said, and this is oftentimes very surprising to people, that a full over 60% of people went on to administer the final voltage shock. And 80% of all participants who took part in all of the versions of this study continued to apply electric shocks after hearing about the learner's heart condition. In fact, as far as we know, of all the replications, there are a handful of people who refuse to give any type of electric shock whatsoever. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of participants in these types of studies. And while this was conducted in the 1960s, the most recent and more ethical replication of this was conducted in 2008 or 2010, I believe, and the studies almost perfectly mirror what was found here. Now, the reason we're bringing up this in this context, even though this is oftentimes brought up a lot when we're talking about either authority or obedience and conformity, is because of the psychological and emotional distress that this caused to the participants. So here is a statement that was put forward by Milgram when he was making notes about the participants who came in. I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who was rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe and twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed to the end. There's also videos of these participants afterwards when they were being debriefed, and it is quite obvious to see the distress that they were under, even though it is not the most comfortable thing to watch. Now, in this case, the ethical violations largely center around the emotional and psychological distress that the participants suffered. These types of distress can be considered harm, though even today, there is still sometimes debate about whether the knowledge gained was worth that suffering. Just for some more reference, the original Milgram's obedience study was conducted after World War II in the 1960s, so about 15 years later, and it was originally designed to show that Americans were not as susceptible to authority and were less obedient than Germans, because they wanted to show that Nazism or some equivalent could not take root here. It was completely unexpected that so many people would conform in such a case. In fact, Milgram is on record to say that he did not think that more than a few percent of people would actually administer the final shock. Another thing that's worth mentioning here, even though please, you're welcome to come to office hours if you would like to discuss this specific study further, is that these were not a bunch of sadists who came in. These were people from all walks of life, and by all intents and purposes, were completely normal individuals like the rest of us. Now, another violation that occurred was that participants were given a debriefing. They were told the actual purpose of the study. They were allowed to see the learner. They were told that nothing permanent happened to them. But they were never told that the learner didn't receive any actual electric shocks. And they were told this ostensibly, or this was omitted, so that they would avoid contaminating future participants, so that they would not be biased when they took part in this kind of study. To leave information out like this is unethical by today's standards. It is true that you can contaminate future participants, but the way that we get around this is by asking people who have completed the study to please not talk about the study for the time that it will be currently open. Beyond that, you just have to trust them. But at the end of the day, many people will abide by it. Now, just a note, we'll talk about this some more later, but a debriefing is when, at the end of a study, the researcher informs participants about the true nature and goals of that study, and then once again gets their consent for the use of their data. Now, sometimes people will say that a debriefing is needed after deception has been involved in a study, but it is good practice to always have a debriefing, because just because you get consent once at the beginning doesn't mean that consent is good forever, and so getting consent once more for the use of their data is important. This is also good for you to know if you're ever participants in a or any kind of experiment really, where even if you have taken part and you no longer want your data to be used in that study, you can ask for your data to be withheld or kept out of that data set. That is totally your right, as that data does ultimately belong to you.